Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us. Speak up. Stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us. Speak up. Stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
This is Kentucky's Voice Radio, covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
Good morning, Kentuckiana. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson of the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. I'm happy to be with you this morning. Happy New Year. I hope you had a great Christmas. A lot of the last 2 weeks, we have had hosts that have been out. We've been running old programming, so a lot of our staff could have their Christmas and holiday season, so I hope you had a great time, and I'm happy to be back. We've had a very eventful break, and so I'm going to be covering some of that today. First, let me handle some business. You're probably listening to us right now on 970 AM in the Louisville area. We are also live streaming on both YouTube and Facebook. If you go to the Kentucky's Voice channel, especially on YouTube, go ahead and hit subscribe to that channel so that you can be updated every time we post new video. If you want to call in if you want to leave a text message for a question, basically, you can do that at 502-571-0970. I also want to remind you that we are a listener-supported ministry / radio program / podcast, a lot of slashes in there. If you want to support our efforts, please do that at kyvoice.org. You go to your web browser and just type in kyvoice.org. There will be a button on there that allows you to donate to our ministry. Also, you can text GIVE to 502-571-0970, and basically a pop-up will happen on your phone, so you can click on that and give through that method also. Okay, we have a pretty interesting show, I think. I'm stepping a little bit outside of what I normally do. We normally cover just Kentucky, maybe a tiny bit of national politics. A lot of this show, I want to deal with some international issues. And in particular, I want to talk a lot about Venezuela today. So our show is divided into 5 segments. This is the first of those. The next 3, probably, I'm going to just basically give you a primer on the U.S.'s relationship with Venezuela, basically what happened over the last weekend, when the U.S. basically extracted the president of Venezuela through a very impressive military feat, but we'll talk about some of the geopolitical consequences of that action. And so if you've been wondering, what are we even doing in Venezuela? What's the reason that, what sparked this off? We're going to cover in great detail the U.S.'s relationship with Venezuela, Venezuela's relationship to its neighbors, and also to Russia and China, and how the U.S.'s action is likely to impact those situations. So if you've been wondering what's going on there, stick with us over the next couple of segments. I also want to address the beginning of the Kentucky State Legislature, which is known as the General Assembly, the long session in even years, which we are coming into. The long session, the General Assembly, the Kentucky Legislature, meets for 60 days. They basically meet almost every day from now until the middle of April. Basically, sometime around tax filing day is the last day of session. In the odd years, which we just passed out of, they only meet 30 of those days. So we are going to go through just basically what's the calendar look like, what are some of the hot topics that are involved, and I want to do a special plug for a big event that's happening. At the end of this week on Friday by 4 p.m. Eastern, I believe, the filing deadline. If you want to run for office in the state of Kentucky, or who knows, if you want to run for the U.S. Senate or a U.S. House seat, you have to have that filing in by Friday. And especially for local races, I want to encourage our listeners to get involved. If you have somebody that you think would be good as a public servant in political office, it doesn't take as much money as you think it does. It also doesn't take quite as much effort as you think it does. We need citizens to get involved if we want our politics to improve. So join us after the break. We'll talk about Venezuela, and thank you for joining us on Kentucky's Voice.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back on Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. If you want to find the website for the Kentucky Liberty Caucus, that's kylibertycaucus.com, and you spell caucus C-A-U-C-U-S. Okay. The next three segments, we're really going to do a very deep dive into the basics of the U.S.'s relationship with Venezuela, the recent action by President Trump and Delta Force and the U.S. military and the CIA and NSA, FBI, basically a laundry list of three-letter agencies were apparently involved in a raid of Venezuela. So let me just start right at the end. What just happened? Right after the stock market closed, apparently, and that probably was pretty intentional. There was an operation by the U.S. government dubbed Absolute Resolve. So if you want to find out more about this operation, you can go online and search for Operation Absolute Resolve. U.S. forces conducted airstrikes on the Venezuelan military sites. They have one major military base, so there are various bombings by U.S. stealth airplane fighters. That was basically cover for an extraction raid that happened where the president of Venezuela, Maduro, and his wife, whose name is Celia Flores, on January 1st were extracted from a safe house that they were living with, transported to a U.S. naval aircraft carrier, I believe, that was stationed off the coast of Venezuela. And now Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is going to stand trial in U.S. federal court for violation of, for basically being a narco-terrorist. This is very similar to a raid that actually happened in 1989. I was a small boy at that point, but I definitely have a recollection of this happening. When Noriega was basically deposed, captured, and put on trial in the U.S. through a law enforcement action where basically Nicolas Maduro's 2020, he was indicted in a U.S. federal court for narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. Basically, Delta Force, SEAL teams, and drones were involved in this operation that targeted the capital city of Caracas in Venezuela. It avoided a full-on invasion, however. This was mostly people flying in helicopters. I don't know, probably a couple of dozen special forces operators from the United States. Killed somewhere between 50 and 100, but if you think of a a military operation of this scale, it's an unbelievably small number of people, even Venezuelans, that died in this operation. Apparently, no American troops died in this. So the U.S. military, through like incredible coordination and tactical skill, was able to take the president of a hostile foreign country back to the United States for trial. Like somewhere between 50 and 100 Venezuelans died, no American troops. So incredible. Maduro, probably in the next year, we'll start to hear how he's being put on trial in New York. Trump justified this as it was a way of ending gang rule of Venezuela. He also pledged that U.S. firms, especially Chevron, who still operates to a small extent within Venezuela now, would invest billions of dollars to fix the oil infrastructure and run Venezuelan oil. So even in the announcements, they took out the pretense that this was just a legal operation. There also was oil as a major component of this. So if our producer can load a clip, this is a very brief summary of what happened, basically what I just said, but with some pretty interesting graphics, and it's only a minute long. So can the producer load that first clip?
How do you capture a high-value target when the whole world is watching? You create a masterclass in deception. The CIA set the stage with a single building as bait and filled the sky with 150 aircraft to create a deafening sonic shield for the helicopters to drop Delta forces. F-35s lit up the perimeter, turning night into day. By the time the dust settled, the helicopters had already touched down and Maduro was gone. We'll also look at how the U.S. uses the F-35 jets in its Navy to launch a large-scale attack, all in the video ahead. In the dead of night that is 2 in the morning, the lights went out in Caracas. By 5 a.m., the president of Venezuela was gone. But how U.S. played a deception games. While the whole world were focused on the aircraft carriers in the Caribbean, a shadow war was being fought on the ground. This wasn't an invasion. It was a surgical extraction. We finally have the declassified timeline of how U.S. forces breached the heart of Caracas and extracted Nicolas Maduro.
Okay, that's only 1 minute of about a 9 or 10 minute video online. If you want to find that online, you can go on X and search for an account called William Shoko, Shoko. A very recent post will have that 9-minute video. It's fascinating. Where they get into all the details and minutia of like the timeline of the extraction and all of the logistic stuff. I don't think it's great for radio, but if you're really interested in that stuff, I recommend you check out that account. Let's do a little bit of a deep dive now into the relationship between Venezuela and the United States. It basically spans over 2 centuries. The United States essentially started in 1776, but you could make the argument it was in 1789 when we finally passed the Constitution that's very similar to what we have right now. Venezuela started as a country in 1835, and the U.S. was one of the first countries to recognize it as its own independent country, independent of colonialism. So the U.S. relations date all the way back to them. We won't obviously go into all those details. By the late 19th century, basically the late 1800s, the tensions began to rise between the United States and Venezuela over territorial disputes that they had, especially with Great Britain. So Great Britain still controlled some other neighboring colonies, and there were some border disputes. Many people are aware of something called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically said that the U.S. is going to control the political operations that happen in the Western Hemisphere, and that Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, the U.S. needs to have the guiding input on what happens in this hemisphere, because the U.S. is just vastly more powerful than all of the other entities in this hemisphere. The U.S. still essentially holds to that doctrine. Stay out of the Western Hemisphere unless you go through the United States. All right. Now, what makes Venezuela an interesting and valuable entity? Can you load the second clip? This is a great primer from a show called Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime, basically talking about why Venezuela is important for geopolitics. Okay. Okay. Well, we'll do that after the break. So I'll just talk a little bit. Can we load the map of Venezuela so we can just talk a little bit about what the country looks like and where the important areas of that country are? So if you're online, you'll see this image, but I'll just describe the most important areas. Venezuela is right at the north of South America. It is essentially, it's about 1/3 bigger than the state of Texas. So we think of Texas as a really large state. It's the second largest, right behind Alaska in terms of overall land area. Venezuela is actually quite a large country. It's basically 1/3 bigger than the state of Texas. It also has 28.5 million residents or so. That also would put it as basically the second or third biggest state. So it's about 9/10 the population size of Texas. So we're basically dealing with an area that somewhat parallels Texas. It also has some other parallels to Texas in that it's a petro state. It produces a ton of oil. That's the major industry there. That oil was discovered, I think it was in 1914. So in 1914, enormous amounts of oil was discovered near Lake Maracaibo, which is basically right off of a bay in the north part of Venezuela. It turned out that wasn't even the biggest oil reserves that they had. There's another part called the Orinoco Basin. It's basically in the middle of the country, kind of horizontally. That area has basically the largest oil reserves in the entire world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia. So we think of Saudi Arabia as producing all the world's oil. That's obviously not true. In fact, the United States produces the most oil of any country in the world. But as far as the reserves that are still in the ground, Venezuela has more oil than any country in the entire world. Now, the problem is they basically have dropped the amount of oil that they are extracting because of various reasons. One is the lack of technical expertise. The U.S. basically pulled out of Venezuela's oil industry, which it had largely built up after there was a revolution that nationalized all of that oil industry, and the U.S. in response to some of that, and later on after Maduro took power, the U.S. imposed sanctions that basically kept them from producing as much oil as they normally did. We'll continue this story right after the break. I hope this was interesting. Join us afterward.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
What would you assume is the most major threat on the world stage? Anybody, just call it out. You don't have to raise your hand.
Definitely Russia.
Definitely Russia. That's confident. I like it. Who says Russia? Anybody agree with her? Hands? Okay, great. Who else?
China.
Stop yelling at me, but China is a good answer. Anybody? Who else? China?
North Korea?
North Korea. Any North Korea takers? And Venezuela? Anybody? Nope. Oh, yeah. One guy in the back. A little worried about Venezuela. Everybody's cool with Venezuela? No threat? Okay. Let me ask you this. Which one of these places can claim to have the largest oil deposit on the planet? More than Saudi? More than Iran? Wow. Okay. What about things like gold? More than all the mines in Africa combined? The fact is that Venezuela is arguably the single greatest resource of oil and minerals on the planet. So, why is this country in the midst of one of the greatest humanitarian crises in modern history? Let's meet President Nicolas Reyes. After rising to power on a wave of nationalist pride, in a mere 6 years, this guy has crippled the national economy by half. He has raised the poverty rate by almost 400%. Luckily for the rest of us, he's up for re-election. So, who's running against him? This is Gloria Bonalde. Now, Gloria is a history professor turned activist. She's running against him on a social justice platform and on the strength of, in my humble opinion, just not being an asshole. Analyst predictions, as of today, have the chances of Venezuela's total economic collapse at 87%. On the news, they'll call it a crisis. But on the world stage, they'll call it a failed state. If you've never heard that term, other examples of a failed state in recent history are Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And if that's not bad enough news for you, well, Venezuela is also the only one of these places within 30-minute range from the U.S. of next-gen nuclear missiles. You will not hear about any of this on the news because the biggest players on the world stage do not want you to. To them, unstable governments are nothing more than the greatest of opportunities. So, Russia, China, can never be the most major threat until countries like Venezuela leave the door open to our very own backyard.
Okay, I hope the radio listeners could hear that audio well, and our video viewers could see the text on the screen for it. Again, that was from a show called Jack Ryan, basically a show that's a takeoff on some of the Tom Clancy movies. But that background was all about why Venezuela is so important. It has the highest concentration of oil and mineral resources in the world. And so let's not kid ourselves. Oil and access to those minerals was a big part of why the U.S. wants to be involved in Venezuelan internal politics. But the point that was also made in that video is there are some larger considerations. Number one, Venezuela is very rapidly, especially over the last 8 years, collapsing as a country. The GDP in the country, and we'll get into that in just a minute, has dropped by almost 75%. Basically, people are starving in the streets. There's been a huge migration of people out of Venezuela up to the United States. So a lot of the illegal immigrants during the Biden administration especially came from Venezuela. And so a destabilized Venezuela gives access to Russia and China to basically take over those industries and station military assets in Venezuela potentially down the road. And Venezuela at the north of South America is basically a 30-minute missile shot from the southern United States. So there are some bigger considerations that we're going to get into. The first, I just want to put a pin in how important the amount of oil and the amount of resources that Venezuela has is. And so can we put up the next clip? I mean, the next image. So the people on the radio can't see this, obviously, but it's how much oil is still in the ground as far as proven reserves of oil in the world. And so on the far left of the graph with the most oil is Venezuela. on the far right, and it's only on the far right of this graph because the U.S. is the 9th largest in terms of the amount of oil that is proven in the world. However, again, the United States is the biggest producer of oil because we basically are extracting it as quick as we can, and there have been radical advances in the ability to extract oil through technological advances like fracking that have led to the U.S. becoming the global leader in oil production. Okay. Nevertheless, the fact that the U.S. is the biggest producer of oil does not mean that we are not importing oil. We are importing quite a bit of oil, in fact. If we can put up the next graphic, there are different types of oil, and most of the oil that comes from the United States is low-density oil that is easy to extract, easy to turn into, gasoline, and therefore it's very easily traded. It's also the type of oil that comes out of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and the United States are actually very good at producing low-density oil, what some people would call sweet. We don't want to get into all those details. However, other types of oil, we think of oil as only one thing, but there are actually various types of oil. The type of oil that comes out of Venezuela and also the type of oil that comes out of Russia and Canada is high density, what they call sour oil. So basically, the oil that comes out of most of the United States and what we call shale deposits is low density. It's high density. It's almost like tar. So like a tar pit is the type of oil that comes out of Canada and Venezuela. Now, that tar pit type of oil is very important for making certain types of products. So not just gasoline, but especially diesel gasoline is much more easily produced from that very thick oil. It's also important for things like asphalt, so fuel oil and asphalt in particular. So many people, I'm sure, don't even know that the asphalt that they drive their car over is actually a product of petroleum, so of oil. And in particular, it's a byproduct of the type of very dense oil that is found in Venezuela and in Canada. So if we can put up that graphic of Canada versus Venezuela oil production, the U.S., probably the graphic before, if you have that one. If not, that's okay. Yeah. So basically, since about 2005, the U.S. was importing about the same amount of oil from Venezuela and Canada. Over the past 2 decades, however, that has shifted. We are now importing somewhere around 60% of all of the imported oil that the U.S. imports from Canada, and it's like 5% or less that we are importing from Venezuela. So the fact that we would be able to get the same type of oil that we are getting from Canada instead from Venezuela, and also, if we go 2 graphics ahead, or the one that has the U.S. map with the refineries, the one with the red for our producer. Perfect. So if you see this on video, that's fantastic. But if not, I can just describe it. The type of refineries that the U.S. has, the biggest refineries to refine that oil into usable products, if we look at the top 8 refineries in the U.S., one's in California, one's near Chicago, but the other 6 are in Louisiana and Texas, like the Houston area, all the way over to kind of New Orleans, the New Orleans area. Those refineries are specialized for processing that heavy, thick oil. And so the fact that most of our refineries that are set up already to process all of this oil, all of this very thick oil, are on our southern coast, very close to Venezuela, rather than being pumped all the way from Alberta and Saskatchewan and Canada all the way down to some of these large refineries, makes it much less efficient to get that oil from Canada than it would be to get it from Venezuela. Okay, so that's some real detail into why Venezuelan oil is so important for the United States. In the next segment, we're going to talk about some of those geopolitical issues, however. It isn't all about oil, and some of that oil feeds into those geopolitical issues. All right, so after the break, we'll pick that up. Thank you for joining us on Kentucky's Voice.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. For the first two segments, we've talked about Venezuela. We're going to continue talking about that, but a different angle. So what has happened in the last decade or so that has made the Venezuela situation so much worse? So first, there was a socialist revolution led by a guy named Hugo Chavez. This was about 3 decades ago at this point. He nationalized all of the oil industry for Venezuela, and nevertheless, all the infrastructure was already built by U.S. companies that he seized, and oil was continuing to be produced for quite a while. However, in 2013, Hugo Chavez died, and he named a successor who was then voted into office, and his name was Nicolas Maduro. So if we can put the next chart up, producer. Yeah, so that production graph shows the increase in the production of oil from Texas and this capitalist society, the U.S., and then a comparison for Venezuela. And you can see it by the chart, and I'm just going to describe it for the people on radio. From about 2020, when fracking took off in the U.S., the oil production of Texas went from about 1 million barrels per day all the way up to now 5 million barrels per day just from the state of Texas. Venezuela, however, was producing during most of the Hugo Chavez era somewhere between 3 million and 2.5 million barrels of oil. After Maduro took over and the infrastructure that had been put in place by U.S. oil companies basically started to break down, and the U.S. had imposed sanctions that prevented them from getting repair equipment, and it prevented the U.S. from participating in the oil industry. The Venezuela's production of oil has dropped off from about 2.5 million barrels per day all the way down to now around 900,000 barrels. So it's dropped off by more than 70% or so. So now Texas is producing 7 times more oil than Venezuela right now. Now, what has been the effect on the Venezuelan economy? So in our next graphic, we'll see the decline in GDP. And so if you're online, you can see this graph. You'll see that basically the GDP per capita, basically how much money is each person in Venezuela producing. This isn't necessarily how much salary or intake each person gets, but it's a proxy for that. So in 1944, the per capita GDP was about $5,000 per person in Venezuela. That's right after World War II. As the oil production ramped up, that GDP per capita actually got up in sometime around 1980, all the way up to about $18,000 per person. It was one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world. Hugo Chavez took over. There was somewhat of a drop, but it stabilized at somewhere around $14,000 per person. This is all adjusted for inflation, by the way. And then when Nicolas Maduro took over in 2013, there was a precipitous drop in the GDP per person, basically a collapse of the entire Venezuelan economy, mostly due to the collapse of the oil industry. Sanctions by the United States, but also a lack of technical know-how in the oil industry, and basically the inability to sell their oil to anybody but maybe Cuba and China. Venezuela to this day basically provides about 5% of the oil to China. The result, however, has been a drop in that GDP per capita all the way back to those 1944 levels. So from $18,000 per person to $5,000 per person on average. And so that's the reason that you've seen those clips online probably a year or two ago of people having to eat cats and dogs. They didn't have any food. They were raiding any sort of grocery stocks. Basically, not only were they not producing their own food, they weren't able to sell their oil to anybody. They also weren't even producing that oil, even if they could sell it. And there was basically a collapse in the economy from somewhere around 2013 onward, and it was only getting worse. Now, in response to that collapse in the economy, you might imagine Venezuela, even though it's a socialist country, they do have elections. The question is how fair are those elections? So you can imagine as the economy collapsed, Maduro did not become a particularly popular politician, even though he continued to win elections. In 2015, the opposition party, which is more a liberal democratic type of opposition, they actually won 2/3 of the legislature of Venezuela. In response to that, however, Maduro basically decided that he was going to create a power that the Constitution had given him of Venezuela. He was going to create a separate legislature that was stocked with people that were supportive of him. So he lost an election in the legislature, and so he created his own legislature that would rubber stamp anything that he wanted to do. As a response, the opposition boycotted some of the next elections, like the 2018 presidential election there. Eventually, however, there was an election in which an opposition leader named Maria Machado. So in that video that we showed of Jack Ryan, they had some fake names, but those two people were really Nicolas Maduro, and the woman that was running against him was Maria Machado. She was very likely going to win that. She won in the primary. And basically Maduro had the Supreme Court rule her ineligible to run for that office. So the opposition leaders basically protested. They decided that they weren't, if she wasn't going to be able to run, most of them wouldn't run. And they backed another candidate by a name of Amundo Gonzalez. He, in the exit polling in that election, he basically had 70% of the vote to 30% for Maduro. However, Maduro controls who counted the votes. And so the end of that election was 51% of people were counted as voting for Maduro. And basically a completely corrupt election where everyone knows that the opposition leader had about 70% of the votes. And nevertheless, the official story from Maduro was that he got 51% of the votes. All right. The result is basically that most of the Western world basically did not recognize him as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. Nevertheless, there was some loyalty there from the Cuban officials that had basically taken over security of Venezuela, and also from the Venezuelan military. So there was not a violent uprising, or at least not one that was that could plausibly have taken Maduro out of power in response to that stolen election. All right. Since that time, Cuba in particular has solidified its more or less control of Venezuelan politics. In order to provide extra security, Maduro made a deal that he would provide oil, about 100,000 barrels a day, I think, to Cuba. And Cuba would provide for security forces to basically protect him and keep him in power. And also to have the technical expertise. They also provided doctors, various other experts to keep the society running, at least at some level. And so most of the people, so in the streets, you aren't seeing rioting, even though the president of Venezuela has left. And that's because most of the people that are actually running the country are still in place. They're mostly Cubans that have taken over most of the infrastructure, the electoral and political infrastructure of Venezuela. All right. Another interesting little note is that when the U.S. actually did make their extraction of Maduro, there was a Chinese delegation on the ground. They had actually come in to talk about probably some oil deals in Venezuela. And my suspicion is that that was not a coincidence, that the U.S. basically did not want China involved in getting the Venezuelan oil supply to be dedicated to China, and therefore they went and took out the president of Venezuela so that China was not able to make a deal for, continued military and defense support, as well as the ability to buy more oil from Venezuela. Okay, so a lot of details there. What are the real political impacts of this? Well, number one, it remains to be seen what the fallout on the ground is going to be of the internally recognized president of Venezuela being taken out and replaced. What we can anticipate is that the U.S. currently has warships right outside Venezuela that is preventing any unsanctioned oil from being exported from Venezuela. That's going to hurt Cuba. It's also Cuba's economy in particular. It's also going to start to minimize the importance internally of those Cuban political figures that have been imported into Venezuela, because Cuba is not going to have the money to basically be backing all of that political infrastructure. There are also close ties between Colombia and Venezuela. Venezuela has provided oil and money to Colombian and Bolivian left-wing militias and also left-wing political figures. They also have propped up some of those governments. So we can expect that those alliances are going to bring. If over the next decade the U.S. does get Venezuelan oil back on the market, it's going to be a competitor for both Canada and Russian oil, which is of a very similar type. So if Russia does not have as much money because they are not one of the only two, they're now one of three producers of this heavy petroleum, it's going to minimize Russian influence. In the short term, also, there are huge gold reserves, both already mined and in the ground. So you can expect that the U.S. is probably going to be involved in extracting some of that gold as well. So the upside is hopefully that we have a world in which China and Russia are minimized, as well as Cuba, Bolivia, and Colombia. All right, after the break, we're going to get into some local politics. Join us then.
Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us. Speak up. Stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson. Over the last 3 segments, we've been talking some international politics. Basically, the U.S. extracted the sitting president of Venezuela. They have taken him to New York, where he will stand trial for being a drug trafficker and narco-terrorist. The actual raid was an incredible feat by the U.S. military. It's actually unbelievable that no more people were killed and not a single American soldier died in this extraction operation. It's also a statement of the incredible military superiority of the U.S. Military. The Chinese had provided basically radar in order to have an early alert that U.S. fighter jets were coming in to bomb Venezuela, and apparently none of those jets were picked up by that Chinese radar. So it may be an indication that the U.S.'s technological supremacy on the military front is greater than what we had suspected. Okay. So I hope that the last 3 segments, which were very dense, we were talking about a lot of details about Venezuelan and American relations and Venezuelan relationships with China and Russia and Cuba, and even a little bit about Colombia and Bolivia, and what a destabilizing influence and possible enhancement of U.S. influence over Venezuela politics is going to result from this. So yes, I would even summarize it as, yes, it is largely about oil and also the other minerals that are very dense, like iron and gold, and there's also rare earth elements that are all over Venezuela. It's very rich in natural resources, and yes, pure money and being able to have access to those economic factors is very important. But those also have geopolitical consequences, and hopefully we touched enough on that you, at least, if you're interested in that, you'll know what to look for, and some of the relationships that you want to explore otherwise. What might happen over the next year or 2 years as the U.S. Figures out what they're going to do with Venezuela, and who's going to be running Venezuela, all of those issues. Now, we want to transition far more local. As interesting as international politics are, and hopefully you gained a lot from our discussion of Venezuela, the state legislature, which is known as the General Assembly, is starting tomorrow. Tomorrow is the first day of the 2026 regular session of the Kentucky General Assembly. They will meet for 60 days between now and April 15th. They are off for a few holidays, mostly on Mondays. I think Martin Luther King Jr. Day, President's Day, sometime in February. There may be another day off, but it's pretty much Monday through Friday from now until April 15th, tax filing day. They're going to be meeting in Frankfort. So the first detail is, where are they actually meeting in Frankfort? The Kentucky Capitol, where they normally meet, is actually closed, and it will be closed for the next 4 or 5 years. And that's the government estimate, so it may be even longer than that, and it may cost more than what they are projecting. I believe the current estimate is $270 million to renovate and basically bring our beautiful Kentucky Capitol, it is beautiful, up to snuff. Basically, they haven't had major renovations for many, many decades and whatever. Now, in order to have a place to meet, they actually built an extension to the building right behind the Capitol, which is called the Annex. They added on what looks like, I would say it looks kind of like mobile homes that are attached to the side of the Annex. I'm not a big fan of the design, but it's utilitarian. They apparently have chambers for the Senate and the House that are separate in that building. What they do not have is a gallery. So if you want to go and observe in person the operation of the Senate or the House on the floor, you will not be able to do that. My understanding is that there will be closed caption televisions, and there will be rooms that will be dedicated for people to watch those closed caption televisions in the annex. Now, most of the nuts and bolts of what actually happens in the legislature happens either behind closed doors that you're not privy to, basically legislators writing bills with the legislative staff, or they are discussing the implications of bills and how the bills might be improved during committee sessions. Those will remain unchanged. All of those meetings happen in the annex building itself. I encourage you to go to those things. Let's go ahead and put up our last two graphics. These are mostly going to be good for people that go to our YouTube channel or our Facebook, and they can pause it and they can look at the general schedule of which committees are going to be meeting on which days. I know a lot of people are interested in educational, K through 12 education, and also they're interested in post-secondary education. So I do want to emphasize that every Tuesday, probably not this week, but it wouldn't surprise me if next week they start having lots of committee meetings. Starting next week, every Tuesday at 8 a.m., they will have the Post-Secondary Education Committee meeting in the House. And then on Wednesdays at 8 a.m., they will have the primary and secondary, so K through 12 Education Committee meetings. Those tend to be really interesting. So if you are looking at our podcast, go ahead and pause that and you'll see a schedule. I'm not sure that it translated as far as the Thursday meetings, but some of that is on the schedule as well. There we go. Thank you, producer. The producer just zoomed out so we can see the full thing. And so on Thursday, the Unified Education Committee meetings will be happening from 10 to 11 in the Senate. So the House has their own meetings. The Senate has their own committee meetings. If you are really interested in speaking on any of the topics that are part of legislation, figure out which day. You have to stay kind of up to date on what bills are going to be discussed in every committee meeting. But you as a citizen have every right to go and to speak and address the committees of the House and the Senate. You can actually talk on camera, on KET, to your legislators and voice your concerns or voice the improvements you want to see, or even just voice your support. Basically say, I think this is a great bill, and I hope that all of the legislators support it. So you basically just need to show up at the time. I would get there at least 10 or 15 minutes early to make sure that you get a seat, but there's a sign-in sheet, and you are able to go and address the committees. Sometimes they limit the time to like two or 3 minutes on topics that are, if they have a packed schedule or there's a lot of people that are signed up to speak. But I encourage you to go ahead and utilize that ability to participate in your democracy and in the legislative process. I do want to emphasize again that the filing deadline, if you want to run for office, if you're wanting to run for the Kentucky House, all of those elections will be happening this year. And so figure out who your current legislator is, see if they're running again, but whether they are or not, you are able to file and run in the primary. And if you are able to beat that person, if you're in the same party, or if you're able to beat them in the fall, in November, when you come for the general election, it doesn't cost as much money as you think. It does require some sweat, but if you think that it's beyond your capabilities, I will assure you that it isn't. We just need more people to basically participate in the political process. So I want to encourage our listeners, anybody that's really interested in politics or wants to do their civic duty of trying to run for office, they need to get 2 signatures from people that are in their party that are notarized on the official paperwork and file those House or Senate race those documents with the Secretary of State in Frankfurt. If you want to run for local office, like a magistrate, a judge executive, a county clerk, a lot of those elections are going to be happening also this cycle. So I encourage you to run for those offices as well. Those are kind of county level positions. They probably don't require quite as much money. But if you have a network of friends that are willing to knock doors for you, you actually, I think, have a chance in many of these races. Okay, some other dates that are important in this calendar that I want to make you aware of. If you want to get a bill filed, you will need to convince a legislator to file that bill for you and to draft it with the Legislative Research Council, the LRC, basically some lawyers that are hired by the legislature to help the legislators themselves draft bills. They will need to get that in by March 1st. There is a self-imposed deadline that the Senate will not vote on any bills that are filed after March 1st. 2 days later is the House, the Kentucky House deadline, their self-imposed deadline they won't talk about bills that are filed after that. Now, if leadership wants a bill to be presented, they will file what are called shell bills. They are basically just a placeholder, and they will committee substitute or file amendments to get whatever legislation that leadership wants to have voted on. Those are not meaningful deadlines for them. They just will slip that in the last week right before the veto session. Okay. The last day to pass bills before that veto happens is on April 1st. So the bills need to be filed by March 1st. The votes have to happen in both chambers, and they need to clear both chambers so that the governor is not able to overrule them and just basically strike them from law. They need to be passed by April 1st, and a lot of votes will happen in that last week. That's where the biggest action happens. So that last week and the week before, that's where the real action happens. Okay, that veto break happens between April 2nd and April 13th. Then the legislators come back in on the 14th and 15th of April, and they basically overrule anything that the governor decides that he doesn't want in law. I also want to have a big mention that this is a budget year. The most important bill that will be filed will be HB 1. It will come out of the House, and it will basically determine where the tens of billions of dollars of state funds over the next 2 years will be allocated. Now, those bills tend to be multiple hundreds of pages long and very hard to process, but if there's a project that you are passionate about getting state money for or state money being pulled from, talk to your legislators really in January, because that's where most of those details get hashed out on the budget. Okay, so I encourage you again to file for office. We need more people participating, and I thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us on Kentucky's Voice. I'm your host, Dr. Lance Pearson.